For centuries, millions of people have genuinely believed that a man named Idris literally levitated into outer space, just to escape the angel of death.
Right, like a physical ascension.
Exactly. They believed he hid out in the fourth layer of heaven like he was in some sort of cosmic witness protection program. But today, we are looking at an ancient text that says, well, he wasn't an ancient astronaut. He was a data scientist.
I mean, it is the ultimate paradigm shift.
Yeah.
We are taking texts that have basically been read as bedtime stories and magical folklore for centuries, and we're finally looking at the actual raw linguistic data underneath them.
Yeah, and it's mind-blowing. Welcome to today's Deep Dive. I'm your host, and today we are not doing some dusty, polite review of ancient mythology. We're doing a full-blown excavation.
Absolutely. We're digging deep.
And our mission, and we are bringing you, the listener, right into the center of this with us, is to ruthlessly strip away centuries of literalist mythological interpretations from a very specific, profound piece of historical text. I'm talking about Surah Maryam, Ayat 56 through 61.
And we are doing this based on the analytical framework laid out in the Tolu'i Islam digital audio lectures, specifically lecture 9 out of 13.
Right. And what we find when we apply that framework is, it's nothing short of staggering.
It changes everything. It really does.
It totally transforms the text.
Yeah.
We are taking what has traditionally been read as this simple, almost simplistic moralizing warning, just a story about praying on time. And we are revealing it to be this brilliant, highly sophisticated treatise on historical sociology.
Yeah, an organizational collapse. It's a blueprint of how societies fail.
Exactly. So if you are listening to this right now, I am asking you to just set aside everything you think you know about these old prophetic stories. Clear the slate entirely.
Yeah, just wipe it clean.
Prepare to view history, not as a series of divine temper tantrums or magical interventions, but as a series of predictable, mathematical, law-abiding feedback loops.
Because that is exactly what the text is actually describing, right? The mechanics beneath the mythology. It's pure social physics.
Okay, let's unpack this and jump right into the hook here. It's this figure of Idris. In the traditional Orthodox narrative, the one that, gets repeated in millions of sermons, we hear this very basic story.
The standard folklore.
Right. We hear that God loved Idris because he was so pious, so God physically levitated him up into the sky. And then we get this sad little footnote that later generations stopped doing their daily ritual prayers and went to hell. Unless, of course, they repented, in which case they get to go to a physical garden in the afterlife.
Which I have to say is exactly how centuries of mystical placeholders have entirely blinded us to the actual laws of historical sociology. When you look at the linguistic roots, Idris isn't an astronaut.
No spacesuit required.
Exactly. The name Idris actually comes from the Arabic root darsa.
Okay, wait, hold on. I want to push back right out of the gate here. How do you get from a pious prophet to a data-driven organizational analyst? Because that is a massive conceptual leap.
It sounds like a leap, sure.
Like, how does the Tolu'i Islam framework justify looking at a name and extracting this whole scientific archetype?
Well, because in ancient Arabic semantics, names in these texts aren't just phonetic tags, They aren't just labels like Bob or Steve.
Right, they have baked-in meaning.
Exactly. They are descriptive titles. They describe the defining characteristic of a movement or a whole society. So the root darsa means to study, to read carefully, to leave a mark, or to trace something back to its origins.
Oh, wow. So it's inherently analytical.
It is the absolute archetype of intense research, data-driven analysis, and systemic codification. The text says God raised him to a high station, but because later generations lost the intellectual capacity to understand sociology,
They took it literally.
right, they assumed high meant literal altitude. They thought it meant physical elevation.
So they translated a societal promotion into a literal rocket launch.
That is exactly what happened. Raising Idris to a high station actually means elevating a society that is built on darsa, a society built on research, analysis, and verifiable data, elevating it to the absolute apex of scientific and legal mastery.
So it's not about a guy floating.
No, the text isn't talking about a single man going to space. It's talking about the high-altitude performance of an uncompromised, rationally structured civilization.
Okay, this fundamentally shatters the physical imagery that has dominated the commentary for, what, a millennium? But why? Why did humanity spend over 1,000 years believing this guy was floating in the stratosphere?
It comes down to a tragic and honestly almost comical confusion of two distinct linguistic concepts, makan and makanat.
Okay, break those down for us.
Sure. So makan means physical, geographical space. If I move my chair from the kitchen to the living room, I am changing my makan.
Right, physical location.
But makan means elevated status, rank, or societal dignity. So if a junior analyst becomes the CEO of a company, she has elevated her makanat. She didn't literally float up to the ceiling of the boardroom, right?
Right. If I say someone is climbing the corporate ladder, I don't mean they are at the hardware store buying aluminum rungs. I mean, their systemic influence is increasing.
Precisely. But what happens when a society culturally degrades? When an entire civilization loses the intellectual rigor to understand metaphor, systemic dynamics, and social physics?
They physicalize everything.
Everything. They physicalize the entire text. And the analytical framework we are studying spends a significant amount of time highlighting the sheer absurdity of these spatial literalist interpretations.
Because it just leads to nonsense.
Complete nonsense, because when you lose the capacity for abstraction, you start inventing logistical nightmares to explain philosophical texts.
And that leads to these wild, culturally injected folk tales. Like the framework points out the stories of Idris arguing with the angel of death because he didn't want to die, and then negotiating to hide out in the fourth heaven.
Which is just, I mean, it's wild.
It is. Because if you think about it for more than 5 seconds, it treats the universe like a multi-story parking garage where God only patrols the top floor. It makes no sense.
It is utterly absurd. And the framework brings up similar folklore surrounding Moses, too. There are literal tales, widely circulated and actually believed, of Moses physically fighting off the angel of death.
Wait, really? Like a fist fight?
Yes. Slapping the angel in the face and popping his eye out.
Wait, popping the angel of death's eye out? That sounds like a Saturday morning cartoon, not theology.
Yeah.
I mean, what is the psychological utility of inventing a story like that?
Well, the psychological utility is comfort for a degraded mind. If you don't understand the immutable, unseen laws of biology and societal decay, you just invent a physical monster you can punch.
Wow. So it turns mortality into a bar fight.
Exactly. It turns the profound, unyielding reality of mortality into a literal brawl. The framework brings these stories up to demonstrate a critical historical point. This is how rapidly a profound philosophical text devolves into absurd, localized mythology when a society loses its cognitive engine.
They drag universal laws down into the mud of their local superstitions.
Yes, exactly.
This actually brings up the core tension here. The real biting critique this framework is making about how humanity views the concept of God itself. It seems like the text is heavily critiquing the idea of a localized, physical God sitting on a physical throne somewhere past Jupiter.
Oh, absolutely.
Because if you follow the logic, if God is universally present, if the divine is, as the text states elsewhere, closer to you than your jugular vein, then physical ascension makes absolutely no sense.
It is a massive spatial paradox. If the divine reality is universally present and infinite, which way is up to get closer to it?
Right. Where are you going?
You cannot travel through physical space to reach a non-spatial reality. You can't, put coordinates in a GPS to find an abstract truth. The framework explains that true closeness to the divine isn't measured in miles or light years or altitude.
So how is it measured then?
It is measured in the alignment of a society's characteristics with universal divine laws. When you align your societal structure with absolute justice, equitable distribution of resources, and unyielding reason, you achieve that closeness.
Ah, I see.
Your makanat, your status, is elevated. The distance is qualitative, not quantitative.
But the moment you translate closeness to God into physical distances, you completely destroy the metaphorical brilliance of the text. And worse, you force yourself to invent these ridiculous logistical solutions. Like, if a prophet went up, how does he come back down?
This is exactly the trap of superstition, and the framework draws a direct parallel here to the orthodox beliefs surrounding the physical ascension of Jesus.
Oh, this is a huge one.
Right. Once a culture establishes the unverified premise that Jesus was taken up physically to a spatial heaven with his biological body, they create an absolute logistical nightmare for his supposed return.
Right, because then people start asking, well, what's his entry trajectory? Does he have a parachute? Where exactly is he going to land? Do we need to build a landing pad?
Exactly. And the lecture notes those humorous historical anecdotes of people building literal minarets, like the one in Damascus, physically waiting for a descent from the clouds.
And you have to ask the logistical question, if someone is descending from the stratosphere, why on earth would they need a stone minaret to land on?
It highlights how physicalizing these concepts tracks human thought in an iron cage of superstition. The actual term used in the text for this elevation is aliyah. In Arabic, this signifies high rank, dignity, and a sublime, unassailable state of being.
Okay, so if we put this all together,
Hmm.
when applied to an archetype born of Darsa, study, data, teaching, codifying knowledge, Aliyah means the society reached an unprecedented peak of intellectual and systemic organization.
Exactly.
They built a civilization that was an engine of reason, firing perfectly on all cylinders, completely aligned with the natural laws of justice.
Yes, they achieved a societal heaven on earth through rigorous intellectual alignment. But then the text pivots. It introduces verse 59, which describes the catastrophic collapse of this exact civilization.
And this transition from the apex of Idris to terminal ruin is where this framework truly shines as a masterpiece of historical sociology. Let's get into the mechanics of that collapse.
Let's do it.
So the traditional translation of verse 59 says something like, "Then there succeeded them a generation which neglected prayers and followed lusts, so they will soon meet evil." Now, based on everything we just discussed about Darsa and Makanat, I am assuming this isn't just a story about a generation that decided to sleep in and skip their morning rituals.
Of course not. I mean, think about the scale of what we're dealing with here. We are talking about the collapse of an apex civilization. You don't bring down a globally dominant, scientifically advanced society just because people stop doing jumping jacks in the morning or stop chanting.
Right, that doesn't crash an empire.
No. In the Tolubi Islam framework, the terms used in this verse, Khalfun, Aqazallah, Itabat, Shahwat, and Ghayyan, they form a precise four-part mathematical equation for civilizational self-destruction.
Okay, this is the linguistic deep dive. I want us to take these terms one by one because they really tell a complete chronological story of ruin. Let's start with the word for the generation that takes over, Khalfun.
So traditionally, this is just translated lazily as successors or generation that came after. But in ancient Arabic semantics, the pronunciation weight completely alters the meaning. Khalafun, with the lam pronounced, generally means a good, worthy successor, someone who carries the torch forward.
Okay, that makes sense.
But the word used here is khalfun, with a silent lam.
I have to pause you there because to a listener who doesn't speak Arabic, this just sounds like grammatical trivia. Why does muting one consonant, the lam, change the entire sociological meaning of the word?
Because it's not just trivia, it's the genius of the Arabic morphological system. The structure of the word itself reflects the reality it describes. By dropping the vocalization of the middle letter, the word becomes contracted, choked off, diminished.
Oh, that's fascinating.
Yeah, so khalfun with a silent lam specifically refers to a succession of a decadent, unworthy, rotting generation. It is the systemic rot that sets in after the pioneers have built something magnificent.
Ah, it's the generation that inherits the wealth, the infrastructure, and the institutions, but possesses absolutely none of the discipline, the intellect, or the understanding of why those structures work in the first place.
Exactly. They are the beneficiaries of a system they do not understand and did not lead to build.
If you're listening to this and trying to map it to reality, think about modern corporate nepotism. It's the classic third-generation curse in a massive family business.
Oh, that's a perfect analogy.
Right. The grandfather is the pioneer. He works 80-hour weeks, understands every bolt in the factory, and builds an empire. The father maintains it. But the grandson, the Khalfun, inherits the CEO title without ever working on the factory floor. He doesn't understand the supply chain. He doesn't respect the workers. He just sees the company as a giant ATM to fund his lifestyle. He is a Khalfun.
That is exactly it. And what does that Khalfun CEO do first? He abandons the maintenance of the core business. He stops investing in R&D. He cuts worker benefits. In the language of the text, this action is called atarala.
Now, this is where I really need you to break it down.
Huh.
Because for over 1,000 years, Allah has been universally translated as the ritual, physical act of prayer. People bowing and prostrating at specific times of the day.
Right, the traditional view.
How does the author of this framework justify translating a deeply personal, physical ritual as compromising the state's ideological backbone? Because that feels like a massive departure from orthodoxy.
It is a massive departure from orthodoxy, but it is actually a return to the original root of the word. The root of Allah means to follow closely, to maintain alignment, to adhere strictly to a system or a set of laws without deviating.
Like a train on a track.
Exactly. Think of a train locked onto its tracks. The Orthodox interpretation reduced this vast systemic concept of societal alignment into an individualistic physical pantomime. But in the context of statecraft and sociology, Allah is the collective systemic backbone of the society.
Okay, so it's broader.
Much broader. It is the institutions of justice, the equitable distribution of resources, the social contract, the rule of law.
So when the text says the Khalfan generation awe, or wasted the Allah, it doesn't mean they stopped praying in their bedrooms. It means they stopped maintaining the structural integrity of their civilization. They dismantled the guardrails.
Exactly. They broke the collective alignment system. It's like taking the meticulously engineered blueprints of a skyscraper, blueprints that ensure the building can withstand earthquakes and high winds, and throwing them out so you can build a more comfortable couch on the ground floor.
Now,
You gain immediate localized comfort, but you have fundamentally compromised the integrity of the building. The roof is going to cave in on you.
which perfectly explains why they abandoned the maintenance. They didn't do it by accident. They did it for a very specific reason, which brings us to the third variable in our equation of collapse, ittaba al-shahawat, usually translated as following lusts or desires.
Right.
But again, we have to scale this up from an individual eating too much cake or having an affair to a macroeconomic level. What does it mean when an entire society or ruling class follows lusts?
When you scale ittaba al-shahawat up to the societal level, it means the pursuit of unregulated self-interest becomes the primary driving force of the economy and the governance structure. It is the absolute privatization of the public good.
Okay, give me a historical or modern anchor for this. What does that actually look like in practice?
Well, look at the lead up to the 2008 financial crisis. You had brilliant financial systems originally designed to allocate capital efficiently that were hijacked by the Khalfan generation of Wall Street executives.
Well, that's a great example.
They abandoned the regulatory guardrails. They wasted the Allah, the systemic alignment. Why? Itabach al-shahawat. They wanted massive, unregulated, short-term bonuses.
They just wanted the cash.
Exactly. They built predatory systems where the whims, luxuries, and comforts of the few completely overrode the structural necessities and safety of the many. They knowingly sold toxic assets because it served their immediate desires. The collective alignment was shattered by individualistic greed.
That is terrifyingly clear. And it shows that human behavior hasn't really changed in thousands of years. We just invented fancier suits.
Pretty much, yeah.
So we have the unworthy generation, the Khalfan. They break the structural alignment and dismantle the guardrails of justice, ajal Allah. And they do this in order to extract wealth for their own unregulated, predatory self-interest, itabad al-shawat.
Right.
So what is the output of this equation? According to the traditional translation, it says they will meet evil or go to hell.
But the actual word used in the text is Ghayya. And Ghayya isn't a magical lightning bolt from the sky. It isn't an arbitrary, fiery pit waiting for them after they die.
So it's not a spooky afterlife punishment.
No, Ghayya is the inevitable mathematical outcome of the social physics we just described. Linguistically, it implies going astray or becoming profoundly lost. But in a systemic sense, it means absolute structural divergence, terminal socioeconomic ruin, systemic self-destruction.
Because they altered the math of the society.
Precisely. If you stop maintaining the bridges collapse. If you consolidate all the wealth into the hands of the 1% and starve the working class, the economy implodes.
It's just cause and effect.
Yes. Ghayya is the natural law consequence of predatory systems. The societal engine seizes up because they stopped putting oil in the gears, sold the oil for a quick profit, and then acted surprised when the machine caught fire.
This framework is brilliant because it completely scrubs the superstition out of history. You don't need a demon to destroy society. You don't need God to hurl a meteor at them. Unregulated self-interest will dismantle an empire with ruthless, terrifying efficiency. It is the law of cause and effect applied to sociology.
And that transition from the apex of civilization under the data-driven archetype of Idris down into the terminal collapse of Ghayya under the Khalfun brings us to a critical psychological comparison the framework makes in this lecture.
Okay, where does it go next?
It compares the psychological state of the early successful pioneers with the mindset of their decadent successors, and it all revolves around how they interact with information.
Right, let's look at verse 58. This verse describes the reaction of the early successful vanguards, the people who actually built the elevated society. It says that when the data, the I, which means the signs, the evidence, or the universal divine laws were presented to them, they fell down weeping, sujadan wa bukia, prostrating and crying. Now, I have to stop here because this is where my alarm bells go off. We have spent the last 20 minutes saying this text is a rational, data-driven treatise on social physics. But falling down crying sounds like exactly the kind of highly emotional, non-rational, performative religious behavior that this framework is supposed to be arguing against.
I get why you'd say that.
Like, how do you reconcile a society built on hard data with a leadership that falls down weeping?
It does sound contradictory if you view it through the lens of modern ritualized religion. In many modern contexts, crying on command during a sermon is seen as a performance of piety.
Yeah, like you're trying to prove something.
Exactly. It's an emotional show to prove you are sufficiently frightened of a localized God who might punish you. But the Tolu Islam framework flips this interpretation entirely on its head. The expert in the lecture emphasizes that this was not empty forced compliance. This wasn't theatrical weeping out of terror.
Here's where it gets really interesting. So what kind of crying is it? If it's not fear and it's not theater, what induces that kind of profound physical reaction?
It is the overwhelming psychological and physiological impact of absolute cognitive verification.
Cognitive verification. Okay, you need to unpack that for us. What does that actually mean in this context?
Well, think about the history of human discovery. Imagine you are a scientist, an astrophysicist, or a mathematician. You have been struggling for a decade, staring at chaotic, fragmented data, trying to understand a wildly complex system. Nothing makes sense.
Is staring at a whiteboard full of noise.
Right. And then at 3 a.m. in your lab, you see the unifying equation. The variables lock into place. You see the underlying laws. The truth of it is so profound, so irrefutable, and so incredibly beautiful in its flawless logic that it physically overwhelms your nervous system. You weep.
Wow.
Not out of fear, but because your mind and your heart have achieved perfect, seamless alignment with the absolute truth of the universe.
I mean, it's the ultimate aha moment dialed up to an existential scale. It's Einstein realizing the theory of relativity. It's the moment the chaos resolves into order.
Precisely. The weeping, bukia, and the yielding, sujadan, are involuntary physiological responses to the sheer, crushing weight of verified truth. They aren't bowing because a dictator threatened them with a sword. They're yielding to the unyielding reality of universal laws.
So it's an intellectual surrender.
Yes. Their intellect is 100% engaged, and their emotional response is a byproduct of that total intellectual conviction. They looked at the blueprints of social physics, realized they were flawless, and yielded to them.
That is a staggering reinterpretation of the text. It completely changes it from obey and cry to understand and marvel. And the framework uses this to draw a devastating contrast with the Khalfun, the decadent successors. Because the Khalfun do not have cognitive verification. They don't have the math. What do they have?
They have unproven assertions. They have entitlement. The successors rely entirely on unverified ancestral claims of exceptionalism. Their mindset is, well, my grandfather was a pioneer who understood the equations and built this great society. Therefore, because I share his DNA, I am inherently superior, and the equations of the universe will just magically bend in my favor, regardless of my predatory actions.
So they confuse biology with sociology. They think greatness is genetically inherited rather than intellectually and systematically maintained.
Exactly. And the analytical framework pulls a very specific, historically grounded, and highly provocative example to illustrate this pathology: the critique of lineage-based superiority. The lecture ruthlessly mocks the idea that a flourishing society or the concept of heaven itself is a reserved VIP lounge for a specific bloodline.
Yes. The lecture notes explicitly point out the historical Jewish concept of a chosen lineage, but then the expert immediately pivots and launches a scathing critique of modern Muslim caste systems.
Oh, he goes right for it.
He does. Systems that divide people into supposed noble bloodlines, like Sayyids versus the working class, like weavers or laborers. It points out how utterly absurd it is to believe that your biological descent grants you an automatic bypass from the immutable laws of social physics.
It is the ultimate abandonment of reason. If you build a skyscraper with terrible materials, gravity doesn't care if your grandfather was a great architect.
Right. The building doesn't care about your last name.
Exactly. The building will fall. But the Khalfun convince themselves that their lineage is a shield against gravity. And the expert in the lecture details an incredible historical analogy regarding how this mindset corrupts theology. He talks about the concept of the ticket to heaven.
Right. He explains how later degraded generations treated the physical act of circumcision as a literal biological entry ticket to paradise.
They turned the profound concept of societal elevation into an exclusive nightclub, and circumcision was the ink stamp on your wrist that let you pass the bouncer.
And the framework points out the absolute logical absurdity this created, which led to massive, ridiculous theological panic among the clerics. Because once you establish the rule that you need this specific physical stamp to get into heaven, people start asking the obvious logistical questions.
Naturally.
Like, what happens to infants who die before the procedure can be performed? Are they doomed to hell through no fault of their own?
Because the clerics had abandoned universal laws of justice in favor of localized rituals, they couldn't answer that rationally. So as the lecture highlights, they had to invent bizarre, almost hallucinatory loopholes.
Like what?
They literally engineered theological theories, suggesting that if an uncircumcised infant died, they would be placed on a mystical mountain in the afterlife so that a prophet could retroactively circumcise them before allowing them through the gates of heaven.
I mean, it's comical, but it's also deeply tragic. It shows the complete degradation of human thought. You start with pioneers who weep at the profound systemic alignment of universal truth, people discovering the fundamental physics of society. And a few generations later, you have bureaucrats having panic attacks about whether a baby has the right physical stamp to get past the bouncers at the pearly gates.
It is the descent from reason into superstition. They lost the understanding that jhana, whether you interpret that as a flourishing state on earth or paradise in the hereafter, is the mathematical result of systemic action and justice. It is not a genetic inheritance.
Right.
And because they lost this understanding, their relationship with the very concept of God completely morphs. They don't view God as the author of immutable laws. They view God as a tool for their own convenience. Which brings us to one of the most fascinating linguistic and cultural breakdowns in the entire lecture, the concept of the spare tire god.
The Zidrian. When I was reviewing the notes for this section, this concept absolutely blew my mind. Walk us through the etymology and the historical context of this, because it perfectly diagnoses modern hypocrisy.
The term Syrian appears in the Quran in Surah 11, verse 92. To truly understand the gravity of this word, the lecturer explains that you have to look at the historical and practical context of ancient Arab caravans.
Okay, picture the desert.
Right. When a merchant caravan was traveling across the brutal, unforgiving harshness of the desert, their survival depended entirely on their camels. They would load up their primary, strong camels with all the goods, the water, and the riders. But they would always keep one or two extra scrawny camels tied at the very back of the line.
The backups.
Exactly. These extra camels tied at our backs were called Syrian. You didn't rely on them for the main journey. You didn't feed them the best food. You didn't focus on them. You essentially ignored them, just dragging them along behind you.
Like an afterthought.
Right. You only cared about them if your primary camel got sick, broke a leg, or collapsed. Then, and only then, in a state of absolute emergency, you'd pull the Syrian forward from the back.
So when the text accuses a society of treating God like a Syrian,
it means they are treating the divine, universal laws of justice like the spare camel. Or, to bring it into the 21st century, like the spare tire in the trunk of your car.
let's expand on this analogy because it's so rich. The Khalaf, the decadent generation that has compromised the system, privatized the wealth, and operates purely on predatory self-interest. What is their primary vehicle?
Their primary vehicle is corruption. It is nepotism, exploitation, and unverified exceptionalism. That is what they drive every single day. They don't consult the universal laws of equity, honesty, or collective alignment for their daily operations.
No, of course not.
They take those laws, toss them in the trunk, and slam the lid shut. They ignore them completely while they are profiting.
I'm picturing a modern CEO who is actively cooking the books, underpaying his workers, and dumping toxic waste into the local river to boost his quarterly margins. He is driving the vehicle of Itaba al-Shahwat. He isn't thinking about divine laws of justice. He's got the spare tire locked in the trunk.
Yep, completely hidden away.
But then, the SEC shows up at his office with a federal warrant. The stock crashes. His company faces bankruptcy. The structural divergence, the Ghayyan, catches up to him. What happens next?
Suddenly, he pops the trunk. Suddenly, he pulls the Syrian forward. He holds a press conference talking about his faith. He starts praying publicly. He calls on God as an emergency backup plan, demanding a supernatural intervention to save him from the mathematical consequences of his own predatory actions.
He wants God to fix the structural collapse without him ever having to actually change his corrupt behavior.
Precisely. And the framework argues that this is the ultimate insult to the intelligence of the divine system. You cannot actively ignore the laws of social physics to build a predatory system and then expect a magical intervention to prevent that system from collapsing.
Gravity doesn't care if you pray on the way down after you intentionally jump off a cliff.
Exactly. The law of requital, the law of cause and effect, does not work for a society that treats it like a spare tire.
This is a devastating critique of how institutions operate. But this is also where the text pivots from a diagnosis of failure to a blueprint for salvation. Because the framework doesn't just leave us in the smoking rubble of Gaia. It outlines with scientific precision exactly how a civilization can pull itself out of terminal decline.
And this is the most hopeful part.
Right. So the question is, how does a society that has hit rock bottom, a society drowning in corruption and structural collapse, actually turn things around?
What's fascinating here is that the text does not prescribe a magical ritual, a blood sacrifice, or an emotional plea for salvation. It prescribes pure, unadulterated social physics. The law of requital provides an immutable mathematical recovery program outlined in verses 60 and 61. It is a strict, sequential, three-step protocol.
Okay, lay it out for us.
Step 1, you must execute Tawbah.
Now, I know Tawbah is almost universally translated in English texts as repentance, which, again, to a modern listener sounds like going to a confessional booth, saying I'm sorry, feeling a pang of guilt, and then going right back to your normal life.
Which is exactly why societies keep failing. Feeling bad does not fix a broken bridge. In this analytical framework, Tawbah is not an emotion. It is an aggressive, structural action. It means a complete U-turn. It is a total institutional realignment.
Give me a real-world equivalent of Tawbah.
Okay, imagine you are a pilot flying a massive commercial airliner. You are flying through a thick storm completely blind. You've been trusting your instincts, but suddenly your co-pilot shows you the hard data. Your instruments were calibrated incorrectly, and you are currently in a steep dive heading straight into a mountain.
A terrifying scenario.
Right. Tawbah is not sitting in the cockpit crying about how sorry you are. Tawbah is grabbing the yoke, pulling back with all your strength, turning the aircraft 180 degrees, and climbing away from the mountain. It requires immediately dismantling the corrupt trajectory of Iqba al-Shahwat and aggressively reestablishing the Allah, the proper alignment.
Okay, so step 1, stop digging the hole. Arrest the terminal dive, turn the machine around, you execute the U-turn of Tawbah. What is the necessary second step in this sequence?
Step 2 is acquiring amana. Again, we have a translation issue here. Traditionalists translate this as belief or faith, which often implies blind faith, believing in something without evidence. But the framework adamantly rejects that.
So what is it instead?
Amana is intellectual conviction based on hard data. It is a return to the cognitive verification we discussed earlier with the early pioneers.
So it's not enough to just turn the plane around because someone yelled at you. You have to understand the aerodynamics of why you were crashing.
Exactly. The society must re-educate itself on the universal laws of justice, economics, and equity. They must look at the data of their collapse. They must understand why the U-turn was necessary based on verifiable truths.
Because if they don't,
If they just follow a charismatic leader who tells them to turn around without acquiring their own amana, their own data-driven conviction, they will just crash into a different mountain a decade later. Amana is the intellectual fuel that powers the engine of the U-turn.
so we have the directional shift, Tawbah, and we have the intellectual verified fuel for the engine, Amana. What is the third and final step of the recovery sequence?
You execute a milayan. This translates to constructive, gap-filling structural correction. This is where the actual sweat equity comes in. It is the grueling, unglamorous work of rebuilding a broken society.
It's the infrastructure week that actually happens.
Yes. It's passing equitable tax laws, redistributing hoarded resources fairly, fixing the broken educational systems, repairing the literal and metaphorical bridges, and healing the social fractures created by the Khalaf. You actively, physically do the work that aligns with the universal laws you verified in Step 2.
So let me summarize the recovery protocol. Tawbah, Amana, Amila Lian. The institutional U-turn, the verified intellectual conviction, and the constructive systemic action.
And here's the core thesis of the entire lecture. If a society executes that specific three-step sequence, the system, by law, automatically outputs Jannatu Adnan.
Let's focus on that output. Jannatu Adnan is traditionally translated as the Gardens of Eden or Paradise. And just like everything else we've discussed today, this framework completely deconstructs the traditional mythological view of what this means. It's not a passive gift that drops out of the sky, is it?
Far from it. The lecture makes a crucial, hyper-specific linguistic distinction here. It emphasizes that Jannatu Adnan, a highly secure, flourishing, economically abundant state, is an achievement.
An achievement.
Yes, the text explicitly says it is inherited, using the Arabic word waris, but you do not inherit it through your bloodline, your DNA, or your caste, as the decadent successors falsely believed. You inherit it as a direct mathematical return on your constructive investments, your amila aliyam.
The lecture notes also point out a fascinating nuance regarding the word makia used in verse 61. It translates roughly to coming to pass or arriving. And the expert explicitly highlights that you do not just sit passively in your corrupt society, say a few prayers, and wait for paradise to drift down from the clouds and land on your head.
No, you have to journey to it. It is the difference between wishful thinking and systemic progression. The laws of social physics dictate that a flourishing society is a destination. You must build the road, and then you must walk the road.
I think of it like buying a train ticket to a beautiful city. You could hold the ticket in your hand, you could have the belief, the amana, but the city is not going to magically materialize in your living room just because you bought the ticket.
Of course not.
You actually have to pack your bags, walk to the station, get on the train, travel the distance, and do the physical work of arriving there. Matia implies that the destination is absolutely guaranteed to exist if you put in the work to make the journey.
And that guarantee, that absolute certainty that the destination exists if you do the work, is exactly what the term Bilgaib refers to in this verse.
Bilgaib. This is another heavy hitter in Islamic theology. It's almost always translated as the unseen, which immediately conjures up images of ghosts, angels, and mystical secrets hidden behind a cosmic curtain.
Which again mysticizes a rational concept. In this framework, Bilgaib refers to the unseen but immutable laws of cause and effect that govern the universe.
Think about gravity. You cannot see gravity. It is invisible. It is Bilgaib.
But it's real. But you have absolute conviction in its existence because its outputs are perfectly consistent. When you plant an apple seed in the dirt, the biological process of germination happens underground, in the dark. It is unseen. But you have conviction, Amana, in that unseen process because you know it will eventually yield an apple tree.
So when the text says the output of Jannatu Adnan is promised Bilgaib, it means the flourishing of your society is guaranteed by the unseen mathematical laws of sociology and economics, provided your inputs, your U-turn of Taba, and your constructive action of Amila Alian are correct.
Exactly. It operates with the reliability of physics.
This changes absolutely everything about how we view historical failure and societal despair. Because if you look around the world today, it is very easy to feel like we are locked into an inevitable spiral of collapse. But this framework means there is no permanent, eternal despair if a society makes a mistake.
That's the beauty of it.
If your nation hits Gaia, if your economy crashes and your institutions rot, it is not because an angry God hates you or cursed your bloodline. It is simply because your math is wrong. Your inputs are corrupted.
And you can fix the math. That is the profound optimism at the heart of this text. The law of requital means no constructive action is ever wasted in the universe. If you execute the U-turn, the system is fundamentally designed to allow for your recovery.
It is the ultimate message of empowerment through extreme accountability. It scrubs away the paralyzing primitive fear of arbitrary divine punishment. It replaces the anxiety of trying to please a volatile, localized God with the demanding yet incredibly hopeful reality of structural cause and effect. You are not a victim of the gods.
No, you're not.
You are the architect of either your own terminal ruin, Gaia, or your own flourishing paradise, Jannatu Adnan.
The agency is entirely in human hands. The laws are divine, but the execution is ours.
Wow. So what does this all mean for us? Let's zoom out and look at the whole board here. We have essentially just spent the last hour reverse engineering the rise and fall of human civilizations.
Yeah.
Based on the linguistics of an ancient text.
It's a lot to take in.
It really is. We've seen that history is not a random sequence of events. It's a series of predictable, law-abiding feedback loops of elevation, degradation, and recovery. We know exactly how a vanguard society falls apart by breeding a decadent generation that privatizes the collective alignment for their own greed.
Yep.
And we know the exact three-step sequence to rebuild it from the ashes: the U-turn, the verified conviction, and the systemic gap filling. But as we wrap this up, it leaves this massive, glaring question hanging in the air.
What happens when you succeed?
Exactly. Let's say a society actually pulls it off. They fix their inputs, they execute the U-turn of Taba, they do the grueling work of a millennial, and they enter this state of Sunnatu'llah, the systemic abundance and peace. What does daily life actually look like inside that optimized social model? How does an economy function when it is perfectly aligned with the laws of justice?
It looks like an ecosystem completely scrubbed of empty chatter, exploitation, and structural friction. It is a society where energy isn't wasted on predatory games, and that is exactly where we are going next.
Oh, can't wait.
In Lecture 10 of 13, we move to the very next sequence, Surah Maryam, Ayat 62 through 67. There, we are going to break down the actual operational anatomy of a true paradise on Earth, and we will explore how this optimized system guarantees continuous, uninterrupted sustenance for every single member of the society. It is the blueprint for a perfect economy. See you in the next session.
We will see you there. But before you take your headphones off, we want to leave you with one last thing to deeply ponder. Take a hard look at the world around you today. Look at your local government. Look at the massive corporations you buy from. Look at the institutions you trust, or even the corporate culture where you work. Ask yourself, are they running like the vanguard of Idris? Are they demanding cognitive verification, relying on hard data, and maintaining collective alignment for the benefit of everyone? Or are they coasting? Are they running on unproven exceptionalism, driven by unregulated self-interest? Are they just waiting for the systems to fail so they can pull out the spare tire emergency plans of a decadent succession? Think about whether the institutions you interact with every single day are heading toward the difficult but necessary U-turn of Taba, or if they're mathematically locked into the terminal ruin of Gaia. The text isn't pointing to a magical treasure chest in the sky. It's pointing right at the blueprints of the society you and I are building right now.